Okay, hopefully we're not going to have anybody interrupt us as we get started. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrei Bukharev. I'm at Marist College. I'm a professor here, and it's my pleasure to be hosting, right, for the ARRG, the Agency and Responsibility Research Group, a symposium on Ann Whittle's recent book, Freedom and Responsibility in Context. This is really exciting. I'm really looking forward to this. Anne is going to be providing a summary of her book at the beginning, and this will be followed by with comments by Richard Feldman from the University of Rochester, and then Barbara Vetter from the Freie Universität. Did I say that right? Berlin. And Anne, of course, is at University of Manchester, and that will then be followed by a reply by Anne to the commentators. And then we'll open things up for discussion. So I have a 2-hour block here for this whole thing. I do ask that you please mute your microphone when people are giving their presentations. And then, of course, when we get to the discussions, of course, you can unmute yourself if you're prepared to ask a question. Okay. All right. So with that, take it away, Anne.
Hello. Thank you very much for coming today, taking the time out from all your busy schedules. It's really appreciated. And thanks especially to Andrei for organising the whole event on my behalf. I'm really grateful to him. I'm just going to begin by saying a few words about why I ended up writing this book over quite a few years, and then I'll just outline its key claims. So this book kind of grew out of a conundrum I often find myself in, which is I can't get myself to believe anything for very long. So trying to defend ideas to audience is a particularly painful experience, and I apologise for inadequacies today. But I've been teaching freedom and moral responsibility for quite a while now. I won't say how many years. But I discovered that, my fluctuating attitudes regarding these issues was often mirrored in my students. I found it quite easy to switch their reactions depending upon how situations was described to them. And I think that kind of phenomenon has also been described in the results in experimental philosophy. And this book's kind of an attempt to explain this phenomena, both the kind of disquiet felt when you come across the consequence argument and cases of global manipulation, but also that kind of knowledge that, if science proved determinism was true tomorrow, we wouldn't chuck everything out of the window. So I suppose the book's a kind of personal project in that it's really trying to make sense of my own reactions to the issues, and insofar as you might not share them, I doubt my arguments are going to convince you. Just be honest about that. But I hope kind of my reactions are commonplace enough to make the book at least food for thought for those who are inclined like me to sit on the proverbial fence. But it's one thing noting that ambivalent attitudes occur, and it's quite another trying to explain that fact. So obviously contextualism in epistemology is a very well-established position, but how might it get purchase on freedom and moral responsibility? I've been interested a little bit about in the nature of kind of the causal powers since my PhD, and through working through kind of accounts of dispositions, I became convinced that they were contextual in nature. And I thought, well, abilities are kind of like dispositions that people have and powers that people have. So could this be how contextualism gets in the story? And that's kind of the conclusion that I came to. So the book begins, I hope, rather uncontroversially by arguing that agential modals such as can, able, and ability are context sensitive. I don't offer any particular analysis, but I do argue that any acceptable account should take this to be a commitment of their view. And then I try to relate the issue of the semantics of agential modals to that concerning the metaphysics of sorry, abilities and freedom. So in light of contextualism and an understanding of abilities, I argue first that the consequence argument for incompatibilism is incomplete, since it presents us with a context-independent specification of attributions of abilities to do otherwise, which, according to contextualism about agential modals, is illegitimate. So at the very least, we need to do some work revising the consequence argument. So in chapter 2, I outline a possible way of doing that. It's been argued that although agential modals are context dependent, we can specify a sense, what Austin referred to as an all-in sense, and you might argue that that's context insensitive. So according to this all-in sense, the agent must not only have the ability or level of skill to do the thing in question, but also have the opportunity to exercise it in the current circumstances. This sense is arguably important to demonstrating the relevance of contextualism to freedom and moral responsibility, since I think these debates have most naturally been thought to concern our all-in cans. So what I do in chapter 3 is defend contextualism regarding agential modals, which includes Austin's all-in cans. Okay, so how do we get from abilities to do otherwise to talk of freedom and moral responsibility? Well, there's an obvious problem which absolutely everyone here knows, namely Frankfurt's cases. So like many others, I do find Frankfurt's counterexamples convincing. And so I don't think there's a straightforward story to be told from abilities to moral and responsibility. There is, however, a simple account of a kind of freedom or control that can be offered, what Fisher and Ravitza famously refer to as regulative control, which does require the ability to do otherwise. I'm tempted to think that regulative control answers to a notion that we have of free agency when this is considered distinct from issues surrounding moral responsibility. But those who are skeptical needn't be put off, since it'd be good to know if our agency included regulative control, regardless of what we call it. So in chapter 4, I argue we've good reason to embrace a contextualist analysis of the freedom to do otherwise, which I refer to as regulative freedom. Now, there's no, entailment from a contextualist account of agential modals to contextualism regarding regulative freedom, since we can deny the assumption that attributions of regulative freedom inherit the context sensitivity of the constitutive agent modals. Instead, we could say that the attributions of regulative freedom, the circumstances which form part of the definition of the constitutive all-in abilities in question, should be fixed. But I try and argue in chapter 4 that there is good semantic and theoretical reasons to allow that the context sensitivity of the modals is inherited by attributions of regulative freedom. Given Frankfurt's examples, though, the question arises why this would be similar for the case of moral responsibility, or more precisely, the control required for moral responsibility, what I refer to in the book as robust control. One thing that struck me about Frankfurt's cases is that although I think they work, they don't seem to change the issues that significantly, as there still seems to be some important relationship between robust control and the ability to do otherwise. In this, Frankfurt cases seem analogous to the preemption problem and counterfactual analyses of causation. There still seems some important connection between causation and counterfactual dependence. Similarly, I think there's some important connection between abilities to do otherwise and moral responsibility. Moreover, abilities to self-correct or to get it right are evident in reason-responsive theories of moral responsibility, or so I argue, as well as those more influenced by Strawson, such as Watson and Wallace's theories. So I argue in chapter 6 that analyses of robust control either don't, or in Frankfurt's case, shouldn't avoid agential modals. I offer, rather presumptuously, my own very fledgling take on what robust control amounts to, which draws heavily on reason-responsive theories, adjusting them in order to reflect a contextualist account of agential modals. This, I argue, has the benefit of being able to respond to some of their problems and to unify the seemingly independent notions of regulative and guidance control. And by so doing, I also try and defend an amended version of the principle of alternative possibilities and an asymmetry principle for praise and blameworthy actions. In the last two chapters, I kind of take up the main thread of argument again and defend what I'm sure will be the most controversial of the theses, a contextualist account of moral responsibility. Although I use the account of robust control developed earlier as an illustration, it's not required. As long as agential modals figure in an analysis of robust control, questions arise concerning the consequences of a contextualist theory of agential modals for a theory of moral responsibility. Chapter 8 explores these consequences, arguing that there's strong evidence to support the view that attributions of moral responsibility and gain inherit the context sensitivity of their constitutive modals. By offering a very contentious context shifting argument and highlighting the benefits of adopting such an approach with respect to understanding folk intuitions regarding experimental data, plus intuitions engendered by global manipulation cases, I argue that, again, there are semantic and theoretical reasons for embracing that view. In the last chapter, I end by considering an objection to contextualist theories of moral responsibility, one which I suspect is the reason why the view's been left off the table for so long, the problem of unfairness. Briefly, this states that if contextualism regarding moral responsibility is true, then whether or not an agent can be attributed moral responsibility will depend upon the context of utterance. And since this will vary depending upon the speaker's context, whether or not the agent is morally responsible will also vary. Consequently, the very same agent could count as morally responsible in one context, but not in another. This is unfair, so the view should be rejected. So what to say? I argue there's different responses we might take here, depending upon wider views regarding the nature of moral responsibility and blame. One possibility is to offer a conception of moral responsibility which doesn't define moral responsibility for wrong actions in terms of the appropriateness of blame. Another is to offer an account of blame which does not essentially involve harming the agent. But even if we decide against these, in my mind, pretty plausible claims, I think that any potential unfairness can be avoided by making the context sensitivity of our attributions of moral responsibility explicit. Although we need to be careful and stipulate what an agent is morally responsible for in what context, they needn't be treated unfairly. If our duplicates are morally responsible for the same wrongdoing in exactly the same context, and conversely not morally responsible for the same wrongdoings in exactly the same context, then they will overall deserve the same amount of blame for that act, and thus the same expressions of hostile reactions, punitive sanctions, and so on. So interagential assessments will be fair. Unfortunately, there's no arguments in this book that are indisputable, and intuitions to cases will really vary. But what I really tried to do in this book is show why contextualism regarding regulative freedom and moral responsibility is at least a view that's worth considering, and it hasn't been so far. So thanks, or very little. The end.
Thank you for that. Okay, so first up we have Rich Feldman from University of Rochester.
Okay. Thanks very much, Andre. And thanks for your summary. So my comments will be divided into three sections. The first is some praise. The second is a description of a few points on which I agree with Anne. And the third is some points of disagreement. And this being philosophy, most of the time will be on the third. but I do want to emphasize that I really enjoyed the book. I learned a lot from it. I really think highly of it. I recommend it. So I think there's just a lot good there. So let me begin with the praise. I think Anne's book is extremely clearly and carefully argued. I think she's always honest about what her arguments show and what they don't show, keeps track of sort of where we are in the dialogue. She's careful to show how things fit together in a really helpful way. She was terrific about anticipating potential objections every time, or virtually every time, as I was reading through it. I'd think, what about? And within a couple of paragraphs, she was addressing whatever it was that I found myself thinking about. So I thought it was great in that way. And it's really deeply engaged with the literature. So I thought it was really just nicely, very nicely done. I want to highlight a few of the many things that I think she just gets right. I mean, to start with the obvious and least contentious, she starts with the idea that modals, can sentences are context sensitive, and that seems right. I think not much disputed. She highlights the importance of the all-in sense of can in a very nice way. Argues that it too is context sensitive. That's a little tougher one. She talks a good deal, as she said in the summary just now, about the reasons responsiveness view about control, and I thought that was handled very well. And she raised problems for how that view often appeals to the mechanisms that are used in responding to things. She raised problems for that aspect of some versions of reasons responsiveness views, and I thought that was done very nicely. And you know, there's in the literature, there's lots of things where people say generally unfavorable things about contextualist views about anything, and say, you know, you run into trouble with indirect discourse or various kinds of places where the terms appear. And I thought she did a very nice job of dispensing with a lot of those broader kinds of general concerns about contextualism. So let me turn to some of the concerns. And I think what I'll do, just maybe, I don't know that this will be helpful, but just because of how I come at this from more of an epistemologist's perspective, I'm going to say just a few words about epistemology, contextualism and epistemology, and my thoughts about that. And then I'll turn to the freedom and determinism and responsibility issues. So I think there's at least a plausible case to be made for the view that sentences using the word knows display some kind of context sensitivity. At least this much is pretty clearly true, that people can become more reluctant to attribute knowledge when the stakes go up. That there's variations in when people will be willing to attribute knowledge. It is another thing to conclude that their seemingly conflicting attitudes are all right. And I'm not going to get into that now, but I'm willing to concede for the current discussion that they can be. So I'm not denying the context sensitivity of knowledge sentences. But I don't think that this fact about context sensitivity does much to help us with at least what I regard as the most troubling kinds of arguments about skepticism. So if contextualists are, I'm going to skip something I was going to say, but the contextualist solution to the puzzles about skepticism is very roughly, skeptics are right when we're in high context standards and we ascribe knowledge. It's false. People don't, knowledge ascriptions in high standards context are false. And roughly, though, not necessarily, not in all cases, the high standard context are those in which we're thinking about skepticism, and the arguments for skepticism are salient, or unlikely possibilities are made prominent. But the contextualist view says our ordinary attributions of knowledge can also be true in ordinary contexts. Thus, we're not wrong when we ordinarily make claims to know. Have to be careful about how we say that. If the current situation, because skepticism has been mentioned, is a high context situation, then we have to talk metalinguistically, or else what we say isn't right on contextualist views. But I'm going to just ignore that kind of complication. The reason I'm dissatisfied with that as a response to skepticism is that I think the harder problem about skepticism is not about whether we have knowledge in the high standards case, not say roughly equivalently, not whether we have absolute certainty about things, but the hard problem rather is whether we meet more ordinary standards for knowledge. And some skeptical arguments, at least, suggest that we don't. And the hard work in dealing with the problem of skepticism is figuring out what to say about that. And so contextualism just says we do know in ordinary circumstances. And while I think that's true, I think the hard puzzle is to figure out why that's true in light of arguments that seem to say otherwise. And so contextualism on its own doesn't say much about that. So I think it, in a way, just sort of it doesn't address the question. I think that something similar happens when we turn to a contextualist solution to problems about freedom and determinism. So I'm perfectly happy, as I said, to say that Ken's sentences are context sensitive. Anne can proudly say of her daughter, a lot of her examples in the book are about her kids, and they're really delightful. So one of them is about, I think, is her daughter who learns to swim, and she can say she can swim now, and that's true. And then, you can imagine the wise guy person saying, well, let's see her do it. And she says, well, she's home. There's no pool here. She can't swim now. And that's true too. And so the context is shifted and the Ken sentence gets a different truth value. And that all seems right. And of course, that has nothing much to do with freedom and determinism. Turning to an example that's maybe a little bit more closely connected to that. You can imagine a parent who forgets to pick up his child after school, and you say of him that he could have, he could have done it. He could have picked her up. But then you might get worried about freedom and determinism, raise the standards and say he couldn't, well, actually considering everything, he couldn't do it. And so what I want to say is that thinking about that kind of issue is sort of missing the point too. And Anne is completely on board with that, I think, because she says it's all about the all-in sense of can, and that's the one that we have to think about. Let me turn to the consequence argument and contextualism and some of what she has to say about that. So the key ideas to keep in mind are, first, that it's all about an all-in sense of can. So it sets aside any weaker sense of can, like that used in the example about swimming and the like. That's just not pertinent to thinking about this. And the argument, as she sees it, turns in part on the truth of a version of the transference principle, a principle premise, she calls it CP, according to which if a person is able to do something that the person didn't actually do, so it could have done something that the person didn't actually do, then the person is able to make it the case that the conjunction of the past and the laws of nature are other than they actually are, or than it is. So I don't have, that principle is widely discussed, and I'm not going to go through the ongoing discussion about that. I don't think I have much to add to what many have said about it. I'll just make one probably obscure comment. In the end, I think that what makes such a principle seem right is the assumption that you can't do something if the facts about your current situation entail that you don't do it. But if the consequence argument or the premise of the consequent argument relies on such an assumption, it's assuming, I think, rather than establishing what the incompatibilist position. In any case, the heart of Anne's final position emerges in the following passage. She writes, both compatibilism and incompatibilism are then, to some extent at least, vindicated. Since in some context of utterance, compatibilism about all inabilities and thus regulative freedom is true, whilst in other contexts of utterance, including those generated by the consequence argument, incompatibilism about all inabilities and thus regulative freedom is true. And I think that's probably the first time in my life I've said the word whilst out loud. Okay, and we might want to worry a little bit about what's true in the context we're actually in, since it sets the meanings of the word of all the various words, but let's bypass that. The reason I don't like this is comparable to the idea I mentioned in epistemology. It feels to me as if this solution gives away the store. I think when I focus hard on the consequence argument and the issues of freedom and determinism, I still think that compatibilism is true. Just as I think we have knowledge even when we're hanging around with skeptics. Anne's well aware that some readers will have this reaction. I mean, she's always aware of the kinds of reactions people who disagree will have, and she voices them in a fair, generous way. So there's a section of the book, the relevant chapter, where the subsection has the heading "Contextualism is too incompatibilist friendly." And as I read that, I thought, yeah, it is. So I thought that the heading was right. And in response, she first says that it's a mistake to think that merely mentioning an incompatibilist or skeptical point necessarily makes the standards rise. So she's not committed to the conclusion that incompatibilism is true whenever we're talking about it. Or I wonder, thinking about it too. I don't think much in the book about whether just thinking about things affects standards in the same way that talking about them does, but perhaps so. Anyway, and she says one has some freedom about setting the standards, and that you might resist raising the standards in the way that they sort of ordinarily rise. So a part of the solution is to sort of resist what the contextualist generally happens. So I think she's entirely right to say that contextualists are free to say what they want about how context shifts, and in order that they can sort of propose views about how contexts change in order to make true whatever they want to make true. And I think contextualism has, let's call it the virtue, to be able to be adapted however they want to make whatever sentences they want true. So if some of us are refusing to say we're not free in certain contexts, contextualists can say, yeah, you're not going along with the change in standards, you're able to do that, and so it all works. But I don't think that that sort of comes to grips with what the real puzzle is. I don't think my judgment about knowledge claims in the epistemology case or freedom case claims in this case comes from not playing along with changes in standards. I should add that I still think, even when I'm thinking about all the causes, all in freedom, I'm free, or you're free too. The epistemology case and this case differ in one way that's worth mentioning, I think. The anti-skeptical work in epistemology consists, as I said, in responding to the arguments for skepticism, Contextualists, of course, can sign on to any non-skeptical view that accomplishes that. That is, contextualists can say in low standard context, here's why you know, and that they can agree with what anybody there says. But the work is done by the epistemology, not by the contextualism. And I think the issue in about freedom is whether we're free in the high standards case. So in the epistemology case, it's sort of low standards that I think are the hard thing. In this, I think it's the high standards case that's the harder thing. My own view is that the consequence argument is troubling, but in the end, I think it fails. But I understand why people might not entirely agree with that. That's why these are really good puzzles. But as I see it, contextualism doesn't really help me understand it, because what it says, at least as Anne develops it, is in the high standards case, the argument works and we're not free, and that strikes me as the wrong solution. Let me turn briefly, I think I have a few minutes left, to talk about moral responsibility. I found this really interesting, and I hadn't thought about matters in this way previously. Anne presents a complex and sophisticated account of what she calls robust control, which is what she says is necessary for moral responsibility. And crucially, even though robust control concerns all inabilities, she says it's context sensitive. She holds that attributions of moral responsibility inherit the context sensitivity of their entailed attributions of robust control. So moral responsibility implies robust control, and robust control is this all-in kind of control, but it's context sensitive. She realizes, though, that non-context sensitive attributions could have context sensitive entailments, that it doesn't follow from the fact that responsibility implies control, that because control is context sensitive, it doesn't follow that responsibility is, she says, and rightly. Non-context sensitive attributions can have context sensitive entailments. And that would roughly be because the standards for the entailed proposition are sort of fixed by the entailing, the context of the entailing proposition. So what's to be said? Why think that moral responsibility is context sensitive? And Anne deals with some potential objections to her view. She talked about one briefly in her comments just now, where from two different contexts, people who behave in the same way are assessed differently and then might get different sanctions or something, punishments, and that seems unfair. And she points out that the view doesn't really have quite that implication, and roughly that from the same context, people who behave the same way are going to be evaluated in the same way. So there's going to be a certain kind of equity. And it could be the context of imposing punishments is going to determine standards. So various things go there. I thought you handled that nicely, but still I have concerns. And so I'll just make a few comments about that and we'll conclude my comments. First, there are examples she discusses. And one of them describes a case of where a 7-year-old child, Sylvia, breaks her younger sister's piggy bank. And as I understand the case, Sylvia acts unintentionally, but carelessly. Okay, so an unintentional but careless act. And Anne says, we'd say she could have been more careful. And thus that we're apt to say, so she's morally responsible for breaking her little sister's piggy bank. She takes that attribution to be true. And I'll note, she says, doesn't just say responsible, she says morally responsible. And I'll return a little bit to the word moral in a moment. But then the story goes on, and the kid's mother, in an attempt to smooth things over, says, well, denies that Sylvia was really morally responsible for breaking the bank. She points out Sylvia is only 7, she's still a kid. And though older than the sister, her action was still unintentional. And so if you really think about the case, she's not morally responsible. And contextualism makes both claims true. First, she was morally responsible. That claim was true. And in the second context, not morally responsible. And she thinks both are true. And I'll just say I'm not moved by that example. And I guess this is an intuition clash, and it's hard to know how to resolve such a thing. But I'll just go on record. I'm not moved by it. I'll grant that it's not entirely obvious to me what to say about the responsibility of a 7-year-old for unintentional actions of this sort. I don't think my reaction would change if the child were a little older or if the action were a bit more intentional. That is, I'd still might be puzzled about just what to say about it until some older state. Anne mentions a couple of other cases involving drug taking and manipulation, but I had the same reaction. And that reaction was, well, these aren't clear-cut cases of moral responsibility or its absence. But I didn't find in myself any inclination to think we're right both when we ascribe responsibility and then right also when we deny responsibility. It might be unclear, but not both. That is, it's not right. We're not right both times. I didn't think it had to do with going along with or resisting changes of context. And I guess, again, this is just autobiographical. For me, the pull of context sensitivity that I at least do feel with respect to no's and even with respect to free, I didn't get with respect to morally responsible. It just didn't work for me. Finally, just want to raise a question about what the word moral is doing here. What's added by calling it moral responsibility as just more simple responsibility? We can ask whether Sylvia is responsible for her behavior. And I guess the comment is this: once we say morally responsible, issues like praise and blame and punishment and sanctions and all that come up, and that's a complicated business. And Anne writes this, this is a quote, contextualism, however, does offer a significant take-home message for how we should approach these further questions. We cannot blithely claim that an agent deserves punitive sanctions because they have the control required for moral responsibility, because independent of a context of utterance, it's not clear what we are claiming. There's no context-independent answer to the question of whether or not punishment is deserved. Of course, were we to make such a claim, we'd be in a context which would presumably set the relevant standards, and they would, if the concepts are clear, make it clear what it is we're claiming. But I don't really see how contextualism itself helps with the questions about the suitability of punishment. Even with a non-contextualist view about responsibility, we can think that an agent is responsible for certain actions, but whether punishment is deserved or appropriate. That is, being responsible for bad behavior differs from deserving punishment for that behavior. And once that point is accepted, I really don't see how contextualism in its own right is a helpfully adds to the discussion. So I'll stop there. Just once again say, I thought this was a really terrific, thought-provoking book. Thanks.
Thanks, Rich. Okay, so now we have Barbara.
Okay, thank you so much. I will be sharing some slides. Do people see my slides? Great. Because as I said earlier, I was asked to write a review of Anne's book, which I did a bit more than half a year ago. I hope I'll remember everything. And I was drawing so many diagrams when I was writing the review. I just needed to do some slides to put those diagrams in. So I too will start with praise, even though the praise doesn't have any extra slides. That's sort of a philosophical disease that the praise sort of just goes by the side. So I thank you, Anne, so much for writing this book. Thank you, Andre, for having us here to talk about it. I also really enjoyed it, learned a lot from it, that it's just so rich in details and ideas and so many things and arguments. And I especially also want to stress the same thing that Richard Feldman just stressed. It's extremely intellectually honest, sort of, and hardly ever puts forward an argument without immediately going to objections. And I had that same experience of thinking, oh, but, and then, you know, no more than one page later, Anne would have something to say about that. So I'm very impressed with this. My comments will be relatively sort of structural. So I will be looking at the overall structure of the book, and sort of note some question marks in some places. Mostly not so much about moral responsibility and actually freedom specifically, but sort of more about the way that the argument is structured. Okay, so I think it's generally, it was just a gap in the literature to have a contextualist view of freedom and responsibility. And another thing to say to Anne is just thank you for filling that gap. Because, you know, when you have, whatever you want to think about contextualism and epistemology, when you have the kind of seemingly faultless yet somehow irrevocable disagreement that you have between the skeptic and the non-skeptic, or the compatibilist and the incompatibilist, it's kind of tempting to think that maybe they're both right and they're just sort of speaking in different contexts. Now, when it comes to freedom and moral responsibility, there have been some attempts to flesh this out, especially for freedom, but I think they missed the most obvious place to look for the source of the context sensitivity, and that's exactly where Anne looks, and that's with can and modals quite generally. And so all of that, I just want to applaud and agree with. That's where to go if you want to be a contextualist about those things. And so I think the structure can be roughly, I think this is not quite right, but it's good enough for my purposes. The structure can be roughly represented as follows. You can think of actually it's morally responsible. You can understand moral responsibility partially in terms of robust control. Freedom is a bit more complicated, so let's just forget about that. Robust control can be understood partly in terms of the all-in can, and you could actually have an error going from free directly to the all-in can, but never mind that. And the all-in can in terms can be understood at least partly in terms of agentive modals more generally, where agentive modals, I think that's a term made up by John Mayer, are just sort of any kinds of modals that express something like ability, opportunity, option for action, that kind of thing. And because sort of each of these kind of probably entails the one further down, we might also think that contextualism in a way can get transmitted, as it were, from the bottom up. So when you start with contextualism about agentive modals, it's kind of natural to think that that contextualism transfers to the all-in can. We'll just see in a moment that Anne doesn't think it's quite that simple. And once the all-in can is contextualist, you might think that transmits to robust control, and from there on to moral responsibility. Now, Anne knows, obviously, because she's always thought about all the objections already, that this kind of transmission does not work automatically. And in fact, she gives sort of independent linguistic evidence at each of these stages. Now, the reason that the independent evidence on my slides is green at the bottom is that I think that's the part where, again, I'm agreeing with Richard here. That's just something that's not to be questioned. I mean, that's about as firm a basis as you could have for a view in philosophy. Contextualism about modals in general and agentive modals as a special case of it. That's like one of the most fruitful research programs in linguistics that you can get. People have been doing this since the 70s, and it just works. And that's masses of evidence that modals are context sensitive, and the agentive modals are just a special case for that. So that's a very, very firm foundation. And here, all the evidence, I mean, that's just so much evidence you could adduce. all fine. I think as we get further up the linguistic evidence that we can have independently of this idea that context sensitivity might transmit gets sort of weaker and weaker. And like Richard said earlier, it's the cases become more and more recherche, which isn't Anne's fault. It's just that's all one can do. But that sort of I think that weakens the direct case for context sensitivity, which is why I think it makes sense to focus on the sort of bottom-up approach, knowing, of course, that transmission doesn't work automatically, context sensitivity doesn't automatically transmit from one stage to the next. But I think the book makes a very strong case for each of these, that it might get transmitted. And so that's the kind of thing I'll be looking at. Part one of my talk will be putting some question marks on the transmission from contextualism about agentive modals generally to contextualism about all-in can. And part two of my talk will then look at the step where we go from all-in can to robust control, which is basically the kind of control required for moral responsibility. And so also question mark on contextualism about moral responsibility. Okay, part one, how about the all-in can? And I'll just stick with my drawings. So the sort of very simple-minded contextualist move would be to say, well, we all know that modals are context sensitive. Freedom and moral responsibility require something like being able to do otherwise, or maybe something a bit different. And Anne goes into a lot of detail about that. But that's context sensitive. And so free and morally responsible must be context sensitive too. Or you might say, here's the consequence argument. But once you take into account the context sensitivity of the modal expressions in there, you'll see that it doesn't work so easily. And Anne looks at that in chapter 2 of her book. And again, as a sign of her intellectual honesty, she says, yeah, it's not that simple. Because even if a term is context sensitive, you can, of course, fix a context within the kind of argument you're giving. And it seems that people who have been interested in the consequence argument have kind of fixed the context such that the can they were invoking here was the all-in can. I mean, at least that's a response to people like Cartry, who's also here, who might say, well, let's just fix the intrinsic features of the agent, and then it all works out fine and no problem with the consequence argument. Obviously, also much more complicated. But Anne takes very seriously the response that said, yeah, no, that's not the can we had in mind. So a lot of weight rests on understanding the all-in can. And Anne goes to a lot of trouble arguing that not just can in general, but the all-in can too is context sensitive, and that's where it gets a lot harder. Now, my first thought was that, well, isn't it obvious that the all-in can must be context sensitive, because after all, it's the all-in. It has this quantifier in there. What does all-in mean? Well, we know the way in which we think about the context sensitivity of modals, learning from linguists and philosophers of language, is basically context sensitivity works as follows. A sentence including can is true just in case it's pre-adjacent, is true in some possible worlds, and context tells us which worlds to consider. And sometimes we consider worlds where only a sort of very small portion of facts is being held constant, like my intrinsic constitution. Then we get to something like a general ability. Sometimes we look at worlds where we want to hold a lot more facts constant across the relevant worlds. Well, all-in tells us that we're holding all the facts fixed. But what do we mean with all the facts? Unless we want to sort of just give in to the incompatibilist, we might notice that the word all, just like the modals themselves, is context sensitive. Quantification is context sensitive. And so, maybe that's where the context sensitivity comes from. But of course, in that sense, we're always holding fixed all the facts, namely all the relevant facts. And so that would just trivialize things and make the all-in can sort of collapse into the can quite general. So what Anne does is she understands the all-in can in terms of basically ability plus the nothing prevents clause. You have You all in can do something, just in case you can do it, you have the ability and nothing prevents you from doing it. Now there's a quantifier again, nothing, which of course is also context sensitive, nothing relevant prevents you, but that will just sort of collapse for the same reason as my earlier suggestion. So what Anne does is she goes for contextualism about prevents. And that's, I think, chapter 3. And I think this is really, really interesting, but I just want to point out first, it's much less of a firm foundation than contextualism about agentive modals, because contextualism about, I mean, this is basically because the kind of causal claim, contextualism about causal claims is much more contentious than contextualism about modals. I don't have a strong view about it, though it did strike me that some of the cases that are given in the book don't seem to me to quite speak in favor of contextualism. So here's one that's discussed at some length. We have an NHS nurse. For people in the US, the NHS is the people running the hospitals in the UK. And the NHS nurse who's considering whether or not a patient's receiving 100 milligrams of a drug prevented the patient's death, when the hospital guidelines clearly state that any patient suffering from this condition must be given 200 milligrams. And so she asserts, no, taking 100 milligrams did not prevent his death because he should have been given 200. But if you have another nurse working in a war-torn country where they were really lucky to have 100 milligrams and the patient was given that and didn't die, that nurse might say, yes, the 100 milligrams did prevent the patient's death. Now, Anne says, since both nurses seem to be speaking truly in these different contexts, the truth value of C prevents E is determined in part by contextual factors. But it strikes me that this isn't really a case in favor of contextualism so much as in favor of the extrinsicality of causal relations, because what we have here is two different situations and not just two different contexts of speaking, which describe the very same situation. So, you know, in a general situation, I mean, if you buy all this, then you might just conclude that there's no context sensitivity in the standard linguistic sense to causation. It's just that whether or not a certain event caused another event depends not just on the two events and what happened between them, but between the circumstances around them. But then that's independent of who's saying what in which context of utterance. So I think we might think of these two cases as just bringing out the importance of extrinsic factors for causation, as opposed to the context sensitivity of causes or prevents. Now, Anne has more cases, and I won't go through all of them, but in thinking about this, it struck me that maybe, just maybe, I mean, that's more a suspicion, but maybe what's going on here is that we're mixing two things that weren't meant to be mixed. One is modal semantics as we have it now, and it basically starts in the 1970s with a paper by Angelika Kratzer called What Must and Can Mean, and that sort of set up the whole research program. The other is an older tradition talking about free will, which thinks about abilities and opportunities, and you could put them together and you get the all-in can. And that seems to be a lot more clear-cut, whereas contextualism has this sort of seamless shifting around of things. And people who talk about the semantics of modals never really talk about the all-in can, as far as I can tell, whereas people who talk about the all-in can, except for Anne, obviously, don't very often talk about modal semantics. And I was wondering if maybe that's sort of a bit of an unhappy marriage that's going on here. Because also, if you look at this picture from the point of view of modal semantics, it's very surprising because the very explanatory power of contextualism about modals is that it alone, just thinking about the different sets of possible worlds that are being picked out in different contexts, that alone is enough to explain all the contextual variation of a word like can. And bringing in sort of extra stuff about causation and prevention and all that, that's just seems to me just contrary to the spirit of the sort of niceness and cleanness of modal semantics as it's being invoked here in the basis. So some doubts about this. Maybe an alternative might be, but I mean, obviously, I haven't done the work. Anne's done all the work. One might think that it would be interesting to just appeal to contextualism by agentive models without going sort of the detour through the all-in can. But I think that would require a lot more direct evidence for the context sensitivity of free and responsible. And I realize how difficult that is. I just want to really briefly take the opportunity to advertise a book on abilities that has one final chapter in which it sort of goes that route. And that was also written by a former student of mine. Okay, so that's my first part. As you can see, I'm still a little bit undecided, but I have some doubts about the characterization of the all-in can and its fit with modal semantics as it's being invoked as the very firm foundation of the project. And I just wonder what you think about that. My second part concerns contextualism about robust control. So for this part, I will just be assuming that can in general and the all-in can in particular is context sensitive, and wondering about the sort of transmission that goes one further step up from all-in can to robust control. So this bit. Now, robust control, well, very often when people invoke contextualism, it's invoked for words that are already being used, like can or knows. And it's a theory about the meaning of these words as they're being used in actual language. Now, and that would go for can, the very bottom, and it would go for free and responsible. These are words that we use, and there are interesting claims about sort of whether or not they're context sensitive. I think these two middle steps, the all-in can, but also robust control, these are philosophers' inventions, these terms. And so claiming context sensitivity for them has to work a bit differently from claiming context sensitivity for ordinary language words where we just have lots of linguistic evidence to look at. So the first thing to do is to say, what do we mean by robust control? One thing to say is, well, it's just the kind of control that we need for moral responsibility, but we can't quite go that way because we want to link it sort of down to the stuff about all-in can and then show that it's relevant for moral responsibility. And Anne has this very sort of simultaneously ecumenical, is that a word? Sort of uniting the different factions and original approach to understanding robust control, which takes into account all the things that are right about the different approaches we have, both regulative control and guidance control, sort of the two main strands in the debate, if I understand correctly, yet at the same time doesn't commit to either of them. And I think the way she does that is quite ingenious. However, I also think that the way in which she does this calls into question the very transmission of context sensitivity from can to robust control. So let's have a look at what Anne says about robust control. She says the relation, so this is just the basic idea. I'll give you the more full formulation in a moment. The basic idea is that she wants to give a functional definition of robust control. The relation of robust control typically, and I'll get to that typically in a moment, typically holds between an agent and their action when the agent has the ability to do otherwise, that's regulative control, and performs the action under their own steam, that's guidance control. So instead of plunging for one or the other, regulative or guidance control, Anne says, well, let's take both, but let's take neither of them as strictly a necessary condition on robust control. Instead, let's resort to this typically here. And exactly what this does was something that puzzled me quite a bit in reading the book, and I spent quite some time trying to figure out how it works, just so you can see that it's also in the sort of proper and full statement of the view. Anne gives an ability account of minimal control, where an agent exercises minimal control over an action just in case they manifest their all-in local ability and to perform that action, and also while maintaining abilities to do otherwise. And robust control is minimal control plus the all-in local ability to recognize the reasons that are pertinent, so that's reasons responsiveness, and also having the all-in local ability to have reacted to those reasons appropriately, especially if there were reasons to do otherwise. So again, we've got loads of sort of both regulative and guidance control thrown in here in the form of abilities. That's why they're ability accounts. That's why context sensitivity is supposed to transmit from ability to robust control, right? I said abilities figure as necessary conditions for robust control in some sense. But almost all occurrences of these abilities are again prefixed by typically. And so I think it's crucial, I think, for Anne's account that this typically is in there. So let's go back to the simpler formulation and think a bit more about what the typically means here. I came up with two readings, and I'm pretty sure she means the second, but let me just give you both. So the relation of robust control typically holds between an agent and their action when the agent has the ability to do otherwise. So, well, actually, I think this would make more sense with the longer formulation. So one way in which we might read typically is just a sort of normally, and if nothing interferes. But if we go back to this, that's sort of a generic reading. So the typically would just be, this is normally true of the agent. This is what the agent is normally like. But I think that doesn't make any sense with these accounts, because then what we have here is, if you generally have the all-in ability to do something, that means in normal circumstances you have the ability to do it. That sounds a lot like you've got the general ability to do it. Some people think that's basically the same thing. And that's clearly not what Anne wants. Anne stresses all-in abilities, which take into account the circumstances, local abilities, which take into account the circumstances, even in what their abilities to do. And also it's about the abilities you have in the situation. If you're in an abnormal situation, it doesn't help that you would normally have an all-in ability to do otherwise. If in the abnormal situation, you don't have the all-in ability to do otherwise, that you're not going to be responsible. So reading typically as the agent sort of would normally have those abilities, that just makes these conditions come out all wrong. And so we shouldn't read it that way. Instead, I think, so here, instead the typically, and Anne does say that, instead the typically is pointing towards the fact that the definition is a functional definition. And I haven't said much about that yet, but let me say a little bit about it. Anne introduces the idea of a functional definition in the book with a quote from Menzies, who gives a functional definition of causation and says the causal relation is the intrinsic relation that typically holds between two distinct events when one increases the chance of the other event. So increasing the chance of another event is sort of the typical feature of causation, but it's not the defining feature of causation. It's just whatever underlies typical cases in which this happens, that's causation. And there's a similar idea in what Lewis says about experiences. They're that which sort of is typically the stuff that's going on when there are certain causal relations. Now, Anne has said a lot more about this kind of definition for moral responsibility in a paper from 2016 called, I think, Ceteris Paribus, I Could Have Acted Otherwise. And there she says, moral responsibility is the relation that holds between agents S and actor or omission A when S is rational. Typically, S performs A on the basis of reasons with which she identifies, and ceteris paribus, S is able to refrain from A, etc. So the idea is moral responsibility is that whatever it is that's present in typical cases of, and now going back to her definition, where we have regulative and guidance control. So neither regulative nor guidance control is strictly a necessary condition for, and I'll go back to robust control here. Instead, robust control is the thing that we can typically recognize by the fact that there's both regulative and guidance control going on. But it's something else, something that probably underlies that sort of the common cause or common source of these two things. And in the 2016 paper, Anne argues that that makes the, if I'm morally responsibility, I could have acted otherwise claim a good ceteris paribus generalization. Now, I think that's a really ingenious way of thinking about robust control, and I think it's really, really interesting, and I really have no objections to it. The only thing I want to say is that if that's how you define robust control in terms of abilities, then I don't think the context sensitivity of ability, even or can, even all in can, is very likely to transmit via the definition onto robust control. And here's why. Here's a toy functional definition. I'm sorry, I had to come up with something that included a context sensitive term in the definitions. It's not a very likely thing anybody's ever used. So let's suppose that in the course of identifying various genes in the human genome, somebody gives the following functional definition. Gene X is that part of the human genome that is typically responsible for being tall. That seems to me the kind of functional definition that Anne gives for robust control. We're not saying that everybody with gene X is going to be tall. We're not saying that gene X does nothing but make people tall. It's just that bit which normally underlies being tall. I think that's the kind of definition Anne has in mind for robust control. Now, note that we have a context-sensitive word in the definitions here, tall, but I don't think that makes the defined term gene X context-sensitive in the same way. If we gave that kind of definition, we probably would have in mind a sort of resolution of the context sensitivity of tall, or maybe it just wouldn't matter because the same gene is responsibility both for being tall for a basketball player and for being tall for a toddler. Or if there are different genes being responsible for these different contextual resolutions of tallness, this is just a bad definition. We should be clearer on what we mean by tall. But because we're looking for an underlying mechanism, in some sense of mechanism, that sort of is responsible for these things, you know, that's not as shifty with context as height. It's just, you know, we want to single out something that really does something here. And if different contextual resolutions for our definitions give us different sort of mechanisms that are being picked out by that definition, then so much the worse for the definition. But what doesn't happen, I think, is that we just get sort of context sensitivity transferred to, you know, definiendum here. Well, and if you agree with me about that, then of course, Anne's very ingenious functional definition of robust control makes it questionable that the contextualism about all in can that she's argued for actually does transmit via the functional definition onto robust control. And so, again, I'd be very interested to hear and what you think about that. Again, I think, as with my first set of questions, the issue is really about the sort of transmission that goes from the bottom all the way up. It would be really interesting to think about the alternative project of sort of top-down contextualism that would start with a strong independent case for contextualism by both free and morally responsible, and then sort of offered some story about contextualism about modals, basically as just an explanation for that. But thinking about Anne's book has made me see just how difficult that would be. And it's not as if I have anything positive to offer by way of doing it. Here's some of the literature I cited, and thank you so much for your patience, and thank you, Anne.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Barbara, for your comments. So, Anne, you have time for your response to Rich and Barbara's comments. So, take it away.
Well, I'll give it a go. And maybe the book's making it clear contextualism doesn't work, but that's something anyway. But I hope I say a little bit more in defense. I just want to begin by, thanking the commentators for such brilliant comments. I mean, they really made me think hard. They were really insightful, and I'm so grateful for them for taking time to read the really overly long book and to share their wisdom with us. So thank you so much. I read Barbara's comments a while ago because they're kind of based on the mind thing, and the other day. So I'm going to start first with Barbara's comments, if that's okay. especially because I actually think they're really beneficial, especially the first lot of comments. I'm sure she'll disagree, but I think they actually clarify the issues and help me out. So the first critical section, I think, is useful to the overall argument of the book, and it was overlooked by myself. So let me just begin by explaining why. Barbara, I think, correctly notes that the argument doesn't have to rely on such controversial assumptions regarding causation. And I mean, as her kind of comments on the NHS case, I tried to give a case where there aren't situational feature differences, but I appreciate that a lot of they'll be thinking, oh, this is just the extrinsicness of causation. So, I mean, I'm convinced, but, you know, hey, I'm sure loads of philosophers won't be convinced by the contextualism about prevention. And I think she shows that, well, maybe we can do without. So I suggested that no incompatibilist is going to be satisfied by pointing out that ability is context sensitive in response to the consequence argument, because they're going to say, look, the ability for freedom and the one that's relevant to the argument is a special invariant all-in sense. That's, you know, that's exactly what Van Inwagen says in the kind of the original statement of the consequence argument. So, you know, that's kind of why I go that way. And, you know, looking at different analyses of this notion, which, you know, do stem from the 1960s often, but lots of other people, Wolf, Nelke, Mayer, they're all referring to it in different ways. They all talk about the ability requires this opportunity or a kind of nothing prevents clause. So I'm kind of taking up what I think is common in the literature there. My quotes here are coming from the Mind Review, but Barbara argues that I can see too much by saying that there's a determinate sense of all in can. I'm not completely sure what she means by this. I mean, I do think there's a notion within the philosophical literature, and I claim that this accords well with ordinary thought regarding the ability required for freedom. And so it's kind of this notion which we might seize upon to try and defend invariantism. But my point is that I don't think this gives us an invariant or a determinate sense of can, since both of its elements, abilities and preventers, in my view, are context sensitive. But I do agree, and this is why I think Barbara's really helping me out here, that we can shortcut the argument that I offered in chapter 3. And my goodness, I wish I had and tie myself up in knots, just by appealing to a context sensitive account of quantifiers, as a nothing prevents can quantify over different factors depending upon the context. So as I see it, that's kind of really positive for the overall argument of the book. I don't know if, you know, we're naturally optimistic here, as it removes the need to appeal to causal contextualism, which is more controversial. Barbara Vetta worries that now, this is a quote from the Mind, that the all-in can seems to collapse into the ordinary can. Now, I don't see why this follows. We can still happily talk about a technical precification of can, and philosophers do. And what they mean by this is it requires both the relevant abilities and the absence of the relevant preventers being in place. All I'm claiming is that when incompatibilists are appealing to this specification of can, there's a good reason to think that it doesn't provide us with a fixed or determinate content due to contextualism regarding quantifiers, and I claim also causation. I mean, I hope there might be some value in noting that the key notions which constitute a more restricted freedom sense of ability are themselves contextual, in both providing further reason to doubt there's an invariant notion which can be appealed to by incompatibilists, and also I think helping explain certain intuitions about freedom and moral responsibility in experimental philosophy by talking about different causal conceptualizations that you might have of the situation. And I mean, I'm thinking I'm going to think more about this in the future, but I also think that Barbara's point here might be really useful actually in linking the causal contextualism debate regarding prevention to that of the quantifiers, and that's, as far as I'm aware, not done, and it might actually strengthen the case for contextualism about causation, and so that might be kind of fruitful work to be done in the kind of prevention literature. So in summary of the first point, I do wholeheartedly agree with Barbara that the case for an invariant sense of all in can is weak. But what I don't see is why this makes a bottom-up strategy seem unstable. More optimistically, not surprisingly, I'd want to put a positive spin on it, saying that it strengthens the case for a contextualist account of regulatory freedom by weakening the assumptions needed to establish that the all-in ability is not a context insensitive notion that invariantists can appeal to. Okay, so that's kind of positive comments on the first one. Thank you very much for this. The second objection, I mean, has the potential to be much more damaging, I think, to the overall project. Barbara argues that there's a tension between the suggested analysis of robust control and the proposed transmission of contextualism to robust control due to the functional definition of robust control proposed, ARC. So functional definitions, Barbara argues, attempts to denote relatively stable features of the world, pinpointing some underlying mechanism which typically fulfills a functional definition. So, for example, I'm just using a slightly different case. In the case of pain, we might argue that the functional definition denotes C fibers firing, but the predicate C fibers firing is not. It seems plausible to assume context sensitive. So we've no reason to think that the functional definition denotes a place, the placeholder of robust control is itself context sensitive. And this is an excellent point, but I hope, I might well be wrong, but I hope it only shows that I should have been much clearer regarding the kind of functional definition I was proposing here. So in particular, I was not conceiving it in the manner of the functional realizers in the philosophy of mind, like Lewis, and now I realize the quotes I give were really unhelpful in that respect. And the reason for that is because in the philosophy of mind, it seems empirically implausible to suggest that there's going to be one state which the functional definition denotes, which we can identify as pain. And so what I was thinking, I didn't say clearly, but I was kind of more thinking of a functional role theorist definition, like that offered by Putnam. So instead, I meant the functional definition to refer to a second order functional role state. So it's a state of possessing some state which occupies a functional role. So it's instantiated whenever there's a complex configuration of properties, which typically allows the agent to do otherwise, to be able to respond to reasons and so on. So I want to say, in accordance with functional role theorists, that robust control is a second order functional role property defined by the proposed theory. It shouldn't be identified with its realizers, since its role will be multiply realized by different complexes of properties in different agents at different times and in different circumstances. But nevertheless, these realizers are still significant, since we understand, well, kind of the suggestion was, we understand permissible exceptions by reference to its realizers on a particular occasion. So just to briefly illustrate, suppose that in scenario S, classic Frankfurt case, Jones's robust control is realized by factors X, Y, and Z, but there's a Frankfurt style device masking his ability to refrain from firing the gun. Still, we might think that factors X, Y, and Z typically realize his ability to do otherwise, even in this scenario, since in most nearby possible worlds where the Frankfurt-style device is not present, and Jones does have these abilities given factors X, Y, and Z. So there's reason to think that even though Jones can't refrain from firing the gun, this could be a permissible exception to the rule. Okay, is it consistent with contextualism regarding robust control? I think so, because which abilities are relevant to the functional definition of robust control will depend upon which abilities are contextually salient. For instance, whether we're interested in local abilities to recognize reasons, given that all the facts about the past are held fixed, or instead just a subset of the agent's properties, such as their phobias. Consequently, whether or not there's going to be any realizers of such an ability and which realizers there are will also vary depending upon the context. I mean, in order just to forestall possible objections and confusions at this point, it might be worth stressing that robust control likability is being understood in a metaphysically deflationary way. I'm assuming that the agent instantiates robust control if and only if our attributions is correct, sorry, if and only if our attributions of robust control is correctly attributed to the agent. So given this, it can be true in one context of utterance that S has robust control over O, since in that context, she has the requisite contextually salient abilities, but nevertheless, it can be false in a different context, since the relevant abilities fail to be instantiated. Of course, I mean, as Barbara quite rightly observes, none of this proves that the context sensitivity of ability actually does transmit to that of robust control required for more responsibility. Throughout the book, I made it clear that such a move can be resisted. And I mean, as Barbara says, I'm not completely wedded to the bottom-up strategy for contextualism regarding freedom. I mean, rather, I try and present a number of different reasons which speak in favour of contextualism, bottom-up factors and top-down considerations regarding theoretical advantages that embracing contextualism brings. What I did hope the bottom-up argument did, however, was kind of to provide a reason for taking contextualism regarding freedom and moral responsibility seriously by offering an account of why and how our freedom and responsibility attributions are context sensitive, because that's kind of where I thought there was a bit of a gap there. So yeah, so thank you very much. And that's, you know, kind of how I'd go about trying to reply to that comments. And I mean, you can see why I need the bottom-up approach, because as Rich said, he's not convinced at all by the intuitions about moral responsibility. So let me just turn now to Professor Feldman's really thought-provoking comments on the book. I mean, they mostly concern the big picture, where I think he rightly expresses some skepticism regarding what contextualism can offer here. So just in his comments on contextualism and freedom, he writes that in contrast to the case of no, in the case of free to do otherwise, I think the issue is whether we're free in a high standard situation. Now, I attempted to agree with that. And so the question is, what counts as a high standard situation? Now, I suggested on behalf of the incompatibilists, CP as a way of capturing what is required for the more demanding attributions of all in cans. The claim that if at T, S is all enabled to A and S is A entails N and N does not obtain at T, N is able to make N the case. Professor Feldman remarks that what makes such a principle seem right is the assumption that you can't do something if the facts about your situation entail that you don't do it. But if the consequence argument relies upon any such assumptions, it assumes rather than establishes the incompatibilist position. Now, I think I to be honest, I think I'm more impressed by the incompatibilist case than many contemporary philosophers. I'll just be honest about that. But in section 2.6 of the book, I do try and show why, from a high standards perspective at least, talk of all inabilities at least seems to commit us to the talk of there being a lack of preventers, and that CP seems to be a natural way of spelling out what that amounts to, in a way which at least does not begin by assuming anything with respect to the debate between incompatibilists and compatibilists, but talks more generally about the nature of prevention. So this provides at least some grounds to think that the high standard situation entails incompatibilism. And contextualism is what I suggested offers a plausible alternative to this by making the varying standards explicit, even in a high standard situation involving all in cans. Okay, but contextualism does concede much more to incompatibilists than most, I mean, pretty much, I'm sure all compatibilists would want. And Professor Feldman's a compatibilist himself, does not like the way contextualism gives away the store, unquote, to the incompatibilist when the consequence argument is in view. So he thinks that when we focus on the consequence argument, we should just say that compatibilism is true. And contentious issues regarding context change aside, let me just focus on the main point here. I mean, I just want to begin by saying that, you know, I do agree that if we can provide an adequate defense of compatibilism, then I do think there's some reason to prefer compatibilism, since it would protect our attributions of freedom from, you know, empirical discoveries regarding the nature of determinism, which would, you know, be a good win. You know, I've been impressed by work by Perroom and Clark and Van Inwagen, that there's a good case for incompatibilism, though. Now, the way I've set up the argument for a contextualist account of regulative freedom in the book, it's set up as an inference to the best explanation. But of course, one of its premises is woefully undefended. So I spent most of chapter 5 saying why I didn't think influential compatibilist solutions to the consequence argument were successful. And I was really strongly encouraged to cut down an even longer version of that chapter, which kind of looked at even more views. But I mean, many views aren't considered, and there's going to be new ones appearing all the time. And that's kind of why, in a way, the book's a deeply personal project whose target audience is going to be people sitting on the fence like me. Committed compatibilists and incompatibilists aren't going to be swayed. I mean, all I can say in defense is why I don't find the compatibilist solutions that I've come across, at least, convincing. Moreover, the reason I tended to find them not convincing is because key terms used in the argument, such as opportunity, ability, preventer, must, finct, were kind of unclear. And I thought that unless they gave these clarifications, they couldn't clinch their case against the incompatibilists. And contextualism seemed to me a plausible explanation of this failure, accurately pinpointing the reason why contextualism seems questionable. I mean, I'm tempted to think that, you know, perhaps contextualism should be thought of as a solution of last resort, when we really not convinced that compatibilist accounts are going to work. Since, you know, even I admit that there's something decidedly unsatisfying about the answer that whether or not we can accurately attribute freedom in an all-in high standard situation varies depending upon the context. But, you know, it might still be true. So turning now to comments on moral responsibility. I mean, I think that Professor Feldman's right to note that the examples of context shifting for moral responsibility are much more contentious. You know, this is where I'm entering the much more contentious bit of the book than that for can, no, and free. I mean, I'm of course very sorry that none of them struck him as at all convincing. I think part of the reason for this, which he mentions, is because everyday uses of moral responsibility are rare. I mean, the term moral responsibility is a bit of a term of art amongst philosophers. It might be more natural to say that Sylvia is responsible for the breakage, or conversely, not responsible when talking with her sister. But unfortunately, the term responsible is highly ambiguous between different uses. To name but a few, we might be talking about causal responsibility, we might be talking about legal responsibility, moral responsibility, or even future directed responsibilities. So philosophers turn to the term moral responsibility to try and clarify the meaning, and you know, that's exactly what I did here. If we substitute kind of for moral responsibility a more common word like responsible, or maybe the closely related word of blame, it might be that some of these examples strike some as more intuitive, although I didn't, due to the ambiguity of responsibility and because of the very lively debate concerning the relationship between responsibility and blame. But if, you know, after a terminological switch, you remain completely unmoved by these examples, then that's when, you know, the argument is going to have to fall back on the bottom-up kind of approach, because you're just not moved by these kind of context-shifting cases. So the control required for moral responsibility is context sensitive, and although there remains a possibility that the relevant standards could be fixed independently of context, looking at the alternatives that have been offered, which I do in section 9.5, it seems that there doesn't seem to be a plausible way of fixing it. So then, you know, the onus is put upon the opponent to say, well, how do you fix it? Given that it's constantly changing, how can you fix it in a plausible way for moral responsibility? So I'm kind of trying to shift the burden a bit there to support the bottom-up kind of approach. And, you know, and so even if you are unmoved by these examples, you know, and it's kind of maybe surprising that we fail to notice the context sensitivity of responsibility, we could still accept that it is more context sensitive and it's just subject to semantic blindness. The last comment concerns what I briefly say regarding the question of punishment in the conclusion. Professor Feldman remarks that I don't really see how contextualism itself helps with the questions about punishment. Even with non-contextualist views about responsibility, we can think that an agent is responsible for certain actions, but wonder whether punishment is deserved. Again, I'm in agreement here. I don't think that contextualism helps us in a way, but I think it kind of complicates matters. But the reason I mention it is because I think it complicates matters in a way which might well be morally relevant. So in the case of punishment, contextualists and non-contextualists alike should both ask what justification there is for punishing someone. My point is just that if contextualism is true and the control we require for moral responsibility varies from context to context, then it might be the case that, for instance, we can justify retributive punishment for an agent if and only if they're morally responsible for a given context C1, perhaps, for instance, an incompatibilist context, whereas a moral education or deterrence theory might need to be employed if they're only morally responsible for A in context C2 and C3. So in other words, given the context sensitivity of our attributions of moral responsibility, we shouldn't just assume that because S1 and S2 are both morally responsible for A and the same kind of blame, that the same kind of blame or punishment can thereby be justified, since we need to consider a further erratum, the context of utterance. I completely agree, however, that contextualism in and of itself offers no answers regarding these further ethical questions. I'm reminded of an aphorism that my PhD supervisor used to say to me many moons ago. He used to say, Anne, no metaphysics in, no metaphysics out. And similarly here, I think no ethics in, no ethics out. that's why the problem of unfairness fails, and also why contextualism could only ever be at best a very small piece of the puzzle regarding freedom and moral responsibility, as I think all the significant normative issues are left untouched. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Anne. Okay. So we have 25 minutes for questions. I'm going to shift my view here so that I have a grid. Sorry. So I can see hands. Sorry about that. There we go. Oh, I'm going to readjust it. Sorry about this. I always forget how to do this. Okay. Okay. Any questions? Looking for hands. Let's see if I'm missing anybody. Oh, Carolina.
Yeah, so you couldn't see my hand, or?
Sorry, I didn't see it. I'm sorry. You're
No,
in
that's
the upper
okay.
corner. So for some reason, the hand was up in this corner, so I just couldn't see it. I apologize for that.
No worries. I'm just wondering if I know how Zoom works nowadays. So thank you, Anne and Rich and Barbara. This was great, by the way. I guess my question is about prevention and why you include prevention in your account of the all-in ability. So one thing that struck me is that people that don't want to talk about causation at all will be really put off by that suggestion. So somebody like Van Wagen, who thinks that the threat that determinism raises is not really something that comes from the assumption that our actions have causes, deterministic causes in particular, but just, understands determinism in terms of something like logical entailment. And that's enough for the threat to arise. So somebody like him would think, well, the problem, if it has to do with all inabilities, is not something that would have to be cashed out in terms of a causal notion like prevention. And more generally, I was thinking, is that really what we have in mind when we say that somebody has the all inability? That there is something, so when you do A, but say you want to say you could have done B or you couldn't have done B, do we really mean to suggest that there was something preventing you from doing B? Or do we mean to say simply that there was something that entailed that you would do A, where A is incompatible with B? So that would be more along the lines of how somebody like Van Wagen is thinking about it. So you couldn't have done B simply because you did A, and A itself is incompatible with B, and A was determined by the antecedent states and the laws. So that's really all you need, right? On this, what is the motivation for having a causal notion? And is that really what we're after with the all inability?
Well, yeah, that's kind of a good question. And you always think, oh, I probably just think in that way because I'm kind of used to those notions. So I think, yeah, maybe there's another way of cashing out what having the opportunity is. So I presume that, all in requires an ability and the opportunity. Would you? So how do we cash out what opportunity is? And it just seems that when you look at kind of examples, it's like, well, there's nothing preventing them. They have no phobia. They have what is required at that time. And if they don't have those things, then they don't have the opportunity. So I just thought of those things like wrong circumstances, phobia, as being a preventer. I mean, whether or not prevention has to be thought of as in causal terms, I mean, maybe there could be a non-causal notion. I don't know. I'm talking out my hat now because I haven't thought about it.
Right. But then your argument that relies on the context sensitivity of causation would not be enough, right? So you need.
But you'd still need
this-
some kind of notion of prevention and what that would count in that context. So I suppose then maybe the quantifier, no preventers, nothing prevents, how would that be cashed out? I still think you'd have a kind of, well, I don't know without kind of seeing the details, but an analogous kind of what counts as having an opportunity. Well, there needs to be nothing getting in the way. How can we cash that out? Well, that's going to depend upon what possibilities we take seriously at that time. And that's going to vary. But obviously, I don't kind of know the details. I mean, maybe there'd be a way of doing it in a compatibilist friendly way. I mean, it's easier for incompatibilism. Yeah, that's kind of why incompatibilism pulls me, because they just have, it's just, there's got to be nothing. I mean, it's just open. There's got to be this openness.
I was actually thinking it's not easy for an incompatibilist like Granny Wagon, for example, right? That's not how he's thinking about it. So there's nothing preventing you from doing B when you do A, and you're doing A is determined. I don't see why.
If something entails that you don't do it, then that's preventing you from an incompatibilist. Yeah, that's getting in your way.
Not in the causal sense.
In some kind of sense that an incompatibilist like Van in Wagon would.
In some logical sense.
Maybe. In logical sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Right.
So it kind of, whereas the compatibilist has a job of trying to work out which are allowed and which aren't allowed. And that's the problem, I think, that is difficult, because there isn't this kind of clear divide. And that's why it just seems to shift. What is allowed and isn't allowed seems to vary. And, that's why compatibilism doesn't seem very clear cut in a way that incompatibilism is. But, yeah. So I think there'd be a way, I obviously need to see it, but I think there'd be a way of spelling out the kind of details which may be able to do without a causal notion of prevention. But I think it would end up looking quite similar.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, Kadri. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'm not, this is not really an independent question. I wanted to actually support and appealing to the notion of ability and nothing prevents. I think that is pretty close to common sense, and is one of the reasons the free will determinism problem is a serious problem. I'm with Richard about it not being happy about a contextualist response. But with reference to something Barbara said earlier about robust control being a philosopher's notion, again, I agree with that. The robust part is control is not. Control is very much part of our ordinary notion. However, what I would say is that you don't get any kind of control by adding no preventers to ability, because no preventers is pretty clearly a causal notion. And just a bit of thinking will make you see that if determinism is true, there is always a preventer in some sense, which I could see that you think that way, and that will drive you towards contextualism as maybe the best option short of incompatibilism. But a fundamental mistake to me seems to be this specifically from linguistics contextualist idea that abilities are a kind of possibility, because you think in those terms then it's pretty easy to say that the highest standard involves more facts. And of course, if you add enough facts, you'll get to logical fatalism. My colleague Jim Van Cleve wrote a very nice paper accusing David Lewis, in effect, of that. I don't know if you know it, but it was called something like Taylor and Lewis Partners in Sin. So I wondered if you have any comments about that, about the fact that that while it's perfectly okay, let me put it this way, I'll try to put it in terms of a question. While it's perfectly okay to say that our common sense notion of all in can, we do seem to have one, is something like, I've got the ability and nothing here and now prevents me from exercising it, right? And I think it's pretty true as well that you go from there, it happens countless times with students, to incompatibilism. But that nevertheless, this move is not justified because it amounts to a particular case of the facts entail that I won't do A, so I can't do it. I.e., while Van den Wagen was very keen to reply that what he wasn't making any simple modal fallacy, that he was especially not a fatalist, doesn't the case for incompatibilism rest on something like that?
Well, yeah. So I was intrigued by, I'm a very slow thinker, but the notion of control you were saying was a causal notion, but preventer was just kind of allowing in everything. Is that?
Well, the dilemma, of course, is control is a causal notion. Abilities are, that's also a kind of causal notion. But if we're willing to say, as we should, surely, that we have abilities other than the ones we're currently exercising, then we want to leave room for not every cause of what one actually does being a preventer.
I mean, I completely agree with that. I mean, in that we do normally think of abilities as kind of more stable, involving intrinsic properties of the agent. And so, you know, we're more likely to hold them fixed. The question is whether there's kind of anything out there that we can appeal to, which is going to stop all the kind of external circumstances entering in different contexts. And I suppose that's what I've kind of been skeptical about when I've been looking at compatibilist suggestions, that there's a way of stopping the kind of ability. I mean, if you look at the abilities kind of literature, it's often they get more and more fine-grained, and that makes perfect sense. You can talk about extremely fine-grained abilities as long as, you know, you're thinking about them as kind of metaphysically deflationary. And it seems that the kind of abilities that we're talking about when we're talking about freedom, they can't be these rich kind of properties that carve nature at the joints, but they do have to be kind of quite non-sparse properties. And
but if I might interrupt,
yeah.
The free will determinism problem is, in a sense, independent of what account of abilities you give. There's lots of different accounts, and of course there's all sorts of problems, counterexamples, etc. But when one worries about determinism and uses terms like a higher standard, and Barbara's lovely diagram showing bottom up, going from all in ability, all in can, sorry, ability plus no preventers. And the next stage up was robust control. The incompatibilist thinks that we have a more robust control if determinism is false. But of course, notoriously, the falsity of determinism just means the absence of a certain kind of cause. And the absence of a certain kind of cause does not confer any kind of control. It's the old luck problem.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, sure. I mean, I completely agree with that. So it's not like you get indeterminism, you get more control. I mean, how indeterminism could help? I mean, that's the kind of different story about how to answer the problem of luck. I mean, the question, I think, is whether or not, when we're talking about ability to do otherwise, whether or not we can give it some stable content to resist kind of incompatibilist pressure to move to more and more fine-grained situations. I mean, it might be that you kind of end up with a skeptical form of incompatibilism. You know, I'm not kind of going for a libertarian, I'm not kind of argued that we should go for a libertarianism incompatibilism or anything. So maybe it doesn't help, but it gives you an openness which might be useful or might not, depending on your further views.
well, openness is a kind of possibility, which isn't any kind of control. You would agree with that, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think control is like responsibility. It's a very ambiguous word, and we can use it in lots of different ways. So when you say I have control, I mean, I don't really know what that means. And the whole kind of robust control was just trying to, give that technical sense. It's what philosophers are talking about when they're talking about the control required for moral responsibility. I mean, whether there is one type of control is, a question.
But again, the incompatibilist worry is that there's some kind of control that is present in an indeterministic world, but absent in a deterministic world, correct? That's what you're worried about.
Well,
or maybe I'm being misled by Barbara's chart. Maybe you weren't so concerned with getting from the all-in CAD to the robust control, in which case I could stop harping on this.
So, I mean, the account of robust control that I prefer is a kind of reason responsive account. So it's the ability to get it right. So it's not, I don't think that freedom to do otherwise is primarily what we're interested in when we're talking about moral responsibility. Rather, it's something closer to the idea that, we can reason in the right way and we can regulate in the right way, and we're in control when we're getting it right. And when we're getting it right, that's good. And if we're not getting it right, then the question is, could you have got it right? And then I want to say, well, then when you start saying, could you have got it right? And that's kind of across the board, reason responsive, Wallace, they're all saying they could have got it right. Then I want to say, well, what on earth does that mean? What kind of could are we talking about? So I think that it's difficult to escape the modals. And as soon as you allow in that could, then that's kind of allowing in the concerns about what kind of specification should be given at that point.
Okay, I guess I just sum up our disagreement. I think with the going back to the all-in can, that there's going to be an element always in whether or not one does the right thing or what one thinks one ought to do. There's always going to be some element of luck which can't be escaped. So, but determinism has nothing to do with it. I'll stop.
Okay, Gunnar.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Rich and Barbara. In light of what you said, Anne, about the no ethics in, no ethics out bit, I wonder if you could say how your approach relates to a kind of approach that some in debates about freedom and responsibility have taken, namely to define what they're interested in terms of a certain ethical output. in particular in terms of desert or in terms of the fittingness of certain kinds of responses. So saying, for example, that the kind of freedom they're interested in is the strongest kind of control or strongest kind of freedom necessary for fitting blame, say, or for deserving blame, something like that, where it's a kind of ethics first approach to the issue, and it seems kind of not obviously connecting with your approach.
Yeah. Well, maybe I was too rash, but I mean, I do think that you need to add that argument that moral responsibility should be understood in terms of blame. And, well, depending on what we mean by blame. So if blame has to do with how we treat people, then we're bringing in ethical considerations. I would want to bring those in at a later stage, but I appreciate that, you know, if you think that moral responsibility is just appropriateness to blame, then in a way you're bringing ethics in. If so, that's fine. I mean, I would want to say, look, what do you mean by blame there? Is it harsh punishment, or is it the judgment that they've done something wrong? I mean, people mean such different things by blame. So if it's just thinking someone's done something wrong, and I'm thinking badly of them in that respect, then, you know, sure. But when I'm thinking about kind of more substantive issues of how that person should be treated on the basis of them being morally responsible for being wrong, then you're getting to kind of more substantive kind of justification questions, which, you know, I don't think contextualism is going to answer for you.
Right. So in principle, we could arrive at the conclusion that it's responsibility and freedom from a specific kind of context that's relevant for whether one deserves to have an action or an outcome held against one in a sense that's detrimental to one in various ways. Might involve punishment or being treated less favorably in various ways. So in principle, that's compatible with your view.
Yeah, I mean, I think that any kind of claims about how someone should be treated would need further kind of ethical argument. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of, if you kind of have, well, they're morally responsible in context C1, so they deserve this blame, and then we can justify this kind of treatment, then that's perfectly compatible. But I do think that that would be adding more than I've done here.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it looks like we are out of time. I think, though, that we are all in agreement that Anne, Barbara, and Rich all deserve our thanks and praise once again. So for their agreeing to participate in this today. And I want to thank all of you for showing up today. And do keep your eyes on the ARRG site for upcoming events. I know that Thomas is scheduling a whole bunch of stuff that's coming up. So do keep your eyes peeled on that site. So thank you once again to Anne for your book, and to Rich and Barbara for your comments, and for everyone for coming out. So be well, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks, Andre, for organizing.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh.
Stop recording.
Hey,
It's good seeing you.
good to see you. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah.